Bias binding is a wonderful, quick and easy way of finishing a neckline edge or an armhole edge, say for example if you don't want to use a facing or an internal bind. And bias binding can be purchased ready-made, or it can be made with the help of a bias binding attachment on our commercial sewing machine. The bias binding attachment just takes a screwdriver to install, and you can purchase them off sites like eBay or in New Zealand Trade Me and in Australia Gumtree. They're really quite reasonable to buy, and it's very easy to use. Simply cut the tape that you require. Bias binder attachments come in various widths. You simply purchase the width you require. If you want a 7mm finish, you purchase a 28mm binder. So how does that work? 7 times 4 is 28. You simply multiply whatever finish width you want by 4, and that is the binder width you buy. It is also the width of the tape you cut. So if you'd like an 8mm finish, you buy a 32mm binder and you cut your bias tape 32mm. 8 times 4 is 32. Using a bias binding to finish a neckline or an armhole edge eliminates the need for a facing. You can also run it in a contrast colour, and it's very quick and easy to do. You'll be surprised just how quick it is. To install the binding attachment, we just need a screwdriver, and to cut your binding you're going to need a set square, which is a square on the 45-degree angle, and generally you'll need a self-healing cutting mat and a roller cutter. You can do this with a pair of scissors, but you just have to be a bit more careful. So what does the bias binding attachment do? It takes our raw piece of fabric cut on the bias, folds and stitches it in one continuous motion. It eliminates a lot of steps that you might have previously done using purchased bias binding. Here's the bias binding attachment that I've just purchased and I'm going to install on this machine. On the side of the box it tells us it's 30mm or 1 3/16 of an inch. So that tells us that this is going to have a finished width, if I divide it by 4, of around about 7mm, which is a pretty good standard width for a binding. And it also tells us here how wide to cut our bias strip, 30mm. So let's have a look inside the box and see what we have. When you open your packet, what you will find is a new feed dog, a new faceplate to change out, and a new presser foot. So let's install this. And how do we go about installing this? Well, the first thing we need to do is ensure your machine is turned off. Take the screwdriver that comes with your machine and open this up and lock your machine by using the presser foot lift in the up position. We're going to remove the screws from the faceplate. First things first, let's take off the presser foot. Simply insert the screwdriver into the screw hole, turn anti-clockwise and let that drop out. Now I suggest you store these somewhere safe, maybe in the bag that you're going to change things out for. Now we're going to take the 2 screws off here on the faceplate. We're going to need these in just a minute, so don't put them away, just put them somewhere they're not going to get dropped on the floor. And when you lift this plate up, you'll see a bit of dust has accumulated. You could always take your paintbrush and give it a bit of a clean out while you're on the job, or just simply blow it to remove some excess dust. The next thing we're going to do is take out these 2 smaller screws that hold the feed dogs in place. These can be a bit tricky, they may be a bit tight. Be careful not to drop these, especially if your workroom floor is a bit messy. They are really hard to find, they're quite small screws. A magnetic screwdriver is a really good idea. Now put this faceplate into the bag with the attachments you've just removed. Store that somewhere safe. Now we're going to install the new feed dog. So the feed dog sits like this, and we're going to put screws in. And insert this into our machine. Can be a bit awkward to do. Now, don't tighten it all the way, just make them firm enough. We'll re-tighten them at the end. The reason for this is sometimes the binding attachments, because they're generic, which means they're made to fit all different sorts of commercial machines, the binding attachments can be a little bit difficult. And because the machines may just differ slightly on size, we'll just tighten this up later. So as long as you get it reasonably firm in, you're doing well. Now this faceplate now goes on over the top of the feed dogs, and we install our two bigger screws. I like to start them off with my hands just to make sure they're in the right place. And tighten them up with your screwdriver. Now once you're assured that everything's sitting in the right place, you can go back and tighten up those smaller screws of the feed dog. So just get back in here and make sure everything's nice and firm. We don't want anything coming loose. And the last thing we do is to install our new foot. You may need to use your knee press just to lift that up a little bit more, and you may need to loosen that screw off just a little bit more. Right, so now you can use your presser foot lifter and put that back into the correct sewing position and close the plate. We're all ready to start sewing some bias. Now just remember that this is a woven bias binding attachment. It won't work with knit fabrics. A knit binding attachment is an attachment you buy for a cover stitcher, but that's in another video we'll detail later. So this is a woven binder. It will only work with woven fabrics on a plain stitching machine. To cut woven binding, we just need a couple of things. First of all, we need our woven fabric, and next we need a set square and a long ruler. There are various ways of finding the woven fabric bias, but I find this is the easiest. I take my set square and I lay it long edge along the selvage. Next I take my meter rule and I place that on the angle. This is my bias. Next I take a roller cutter and some chalk. Now I happen to know that the 30mm I need to cut in width is exactly the width of this ruler, so that makes my job very easy. I'm simply going to put a self-healing mat underneath this woven fabric and use my roller cutter to cut along either side of this ruler. If you don't have a roller cutter, you can use chalk and shears or scissors instead. If you require a different width, chalk in one line and use your ruler or tape measure to measure the width, and then chalk in your second line and use your roller cutter or your shears again. And how much length do we require? Well, I can show you later how to join the fabric together, but really we're just limited by our fabric width. Cutting bias strips does tend to use a lot of fabric, but if you plan this out before you start cutting your garment out, you can often cut your fabric strips around your lay plan so you can optimize your fabric. The other thing I should mention is that you can't sew in a circle with bias. You must always have an on point and an off point. What that means is plan your sewing before you start. If you have a centre back zip for a neckline, sew on and off at that centre back zip. If you have an armhole, sew on and off at the underarm, so you'll need to join the shoulder edge first. Take your binding and place it wrong side towards you and weave it in and out of the bars. Pass the beginning part of that bias tape into the holder and use whatever's on hand, screwdriver, long nose pliers, tweezers I mean, to just feed that through. Once you can get the end of that tape, and remember to always cut the tape a little bit longer than you require. There you go, it can be a bit tricky sometimes. Just pull it through to the left and then just get it to start curling. Once it curls, drop your knee lift, turn your machine on, and you can start stitching. And just check it's folding properly before you go any further. And that's folding beautifully. So now take the fabric that you want to bind and you simply insert it into the space, the gap there where the folded edge is, and stitch as normal. There's no need to change the stitch length. Feed through. Clip the threads and pull it through the machine, and there is your bias tape. We use a bias binding when we want a contrast binding or a seam binding. If we want an invisible finish, we'd use something like an internal binding or a facing. So this is a good example, you can see the contrast. When you're limited by your fabric width and you've had to cut bias strips, you may need to join them. Sometimes you may have smaller pieces of bias strip that you need to join. Just like normal, we're going to sew right sides together, but with the bias strip we can't sew directly across because it will upset the way we sew into our machine. It must be sewn on the bias as well. So as long as your strips are cut on the 45-degree angle, like so, we simply match right sides together, match our seams, and then we sew in a foot width seam from edge to edge, remembering to back tack. And this is our bias strip. Now it's a good idea to press that seam open, and press open means to open the pieces and press it down. You may get away with finger pressing, but that needs to be nice and flat to go through your binding attachment. You can also trim off the threads and the extra piece of fabric at the top and the bottom to allow for one continuous strip, and that is how we join our bias. This is a roll of pre-purchased raw cut binding tape. It sits on the attachment to the rear of the machine. So that sits there while you're binding.